Aloha and welcome to our video on the nervous system. In this video, we'll describe the structures and functions of the nervous system, we'll describe the function of the spinal cord, and then we'll talk about the 5 sensory receptors. So here we can see a picture of the nervous system. It has the brain and the spinal cord, as well as all of the peripheral nerves in it. And that basically makes up what the nervous system is. Now here I wanted to show you just a little bit more about the brain. We can see that we have the spinal cord here and the brainstem, which attaches it. We have the cerebellum down below, and then the rest of it is the cerebrum, and that'll be broken down into the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. The lessons that you'll go through will go and tell you more detail what each of these parts of the brain does. I just wanted you to get an overview of where they are. Okay, so here we can see the areas of the brain that we just kind of showed you real fast, and we'll go over their function a little bit. We have the brain stem we talked about, and this is what controls the autonomic systems of our body, like our heart rate, digestion, our breathing, the things we don't think about but we need to have happening for us to live. We have the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is what controls balance and helps our muscles work together. We have the limbic system, which is where we generally focus our emotions, and especially the stronger ones like anger and pleasure. In the diencephalon, we have the thalamus, which directs the incoming sensory information. So it kind of works as a filter and tells it where it needs to go. We also have the hypothalamus, which regulates a lot of our endocrine system, our glands, and modifies our body temperature, kind of maintains that homeostasis that we talk about often. We also have the cerebral cortex, and in the cerebral cortex is where we find our 4 lobes of the brain, and this is where we have our vision, hearing, thinking, memory. This is our thought processes. So those are the basic parts and functions of the brain. And here we'll take a quick look at a nerve cell or a neuron. Now, the nerve cell has its nucleus, so it does have some genetic material. Coming off of this area, we find the dendrites. The dendrites are kind of like a receptor. It's what brings things in, sends that message down the axon here, where we'll see more little spread outs here, and we have a synapse, which is the gap. And in this synapse is where we don't have any contact. What we do is this part here is all sent through like an electrical journey till it gets to the synapse. And then we release a neurotransmitter. So a neurotransmitter is going to be released here. And what it'll do is it'll drift across the synapse, get picked up here in the dendrites, and then it'll send that electrical current down to the next one. And that's how the neurons work. This axon here, which can stretch out quite a distance, it's generally going to be sheathed, and that'll kind of work as an insulation to keep it working a little bit better and not misfiring or causing other things to fire as well. Okay, so let's begin a quick discussion on the senses, and the first one we'll talk about is touch. Now, when we talked about the skin earlier, we talked about the outer layer of the epidermis, the inner layer, the hypodermis, or the fatty layer, and then we also mentioned this middle layer of the dermis where we find a lot of things hanging out in there. And it is in here where we find our different sense organs for the skin. So we can have thermoreceptors, which are going to sense heat. We'll have a Meissner's corpuscle, which senses touch. We have the nociceptor here, which will sense pain. And then we have the Pacinian corpuscle here, which senses pressure. So you can kind of see as we're going through there that we have all these different ways and all these different components that fall back into this sense of touch that we have. Okay, next up is our sense of smell and our sense of taste. And these two come together because they're interrelated to each other. What we notice is that we have these little particles. So whether it's a taste bud or whether it's going to be in our nose, we have these little airborne particles or food chemicals that are going to come in there. They hit these receptor cells here, and as they hit the receptor cells, it'll send an impulse to the nerve fibers in the brain. And the brain will then process, okay, what is it that we're talking about? What are these things that we're getting receptions on? And it'll start putting together an image of what it is that we're tasting. Taste generally is going to be limited to things like sweet and sour, things of that nature. Our smell tends to be a little bit more where we start creating a pattern that'll be there. Okay, let's talk about our last two senses, sight and hearing. Sight occurs here in the eye, so it's dealing with light. So light will enter the eye through the pupil till it gets to the lens, where it will be focused and projected back to the retina. And in the retina, we have two kinds of receptor cells. We have rods and cones, which will take that image that's formed on the retina and send it to the brain along the optic nerve. Hearing occurs in the ears, and there's several different parts of the ear that we want to talk about real quickly. The first is this outer ear. Your outer ear is basically a funnel. It just collects these sound waves and directs them into the ear canal, where they'll go back until they hit the eardrum. The eardrum's attached to three little bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and it kind of amplifies and corrects those vibrations off the eardrum and sends them to the cochlea, where we have a bunch of specialized auditory receptor cells in there that'll generate a stimulus that goes back into the auditory nerve. So now the brain has that signal that it can look at and process and see what we're hearing. So in summary, when we're talking about the nervous system, it's going to be made of the brain, which was up here, our spinal cord, which is the main thoroughfare for a lot of this information, and then it reaches out through these neurons, these peripheral nerves that we see out here. We also have the sense organs in here, and we talked about those really well. And what the function of the nervous system was is to coordinate and control movements and responses. So it takes in the stimuli that we get from the world, processes it, and sends out the appropriate responses. It also works as communication for various parts of the body. So that's the importance of the nervous system. As always, the lessons will go into a little bit more detail with you guys, so good luck on those, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on the endocrine and excretory systems. We'll explain what hormones do, we'll talk how the excretory system regulates water and removes waste, and finally we'll explain how a feedback loop works. So the endocrine system is a series of glands in our body. We'll talk about real quickly where they are. We have the hypothalamus up here in the brain. We have the pineal gland and the pituitary gland also in the brain. We have the thyroid gland, which we'll find around our neck, and our thymus gland, which is above the heart. We have the adrenal glands, which are located above the kidneys, and the pancreas actually is a large glandular organ as well. And then we have the gonads. In females, we have the ovaries, and then in males, we have the testes. So let's take a look at some of these glands and see what they do. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of these glands. We talked about where they were, now let's talk about what they do. We'll start with the adrenal glands. Those are on the kidneys and they produce adrenaline, and that'll give us an increase in metabolic activity and give us more glucose in the blood. So this is what gives us that burst of energy we need when we have that adrenaline flow. Next are the gonads, and those are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. In males, it produces sperm and produces testosterone, and estrogen is produced in females. We have the hypothalamus, which is going to regulate the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is what maintains water and salt balance in our bodies. That makes sure that we don't get dehydrated and make sure that we have enough salts and stuff that we can function properly. We also have the pancreas, which regulates the level of glucose in the blood, and that's done through insulin. So when you hear about diabetes and people with pancreatic issues, what we're talking about is that level of glucose, making sure we have enough and not too much. The pineal gland up in the brain secretes melatonin, and that's going to help us regulate our sleep to make sure that we get the rest that we need. We have the thymus gland on the heart, and that helps certain white blood cells develop, and that works in the body defense system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We also have the thyroid gland, and the thyroid is going to help regulate metabolism, and it regulates the calcium level in the blood. So you can see how these glands create out these hormones, and these hormones are going to give signals to the body as to what it needs to be doing. So that quickly takes us through the endocrine system. Remember, the endocrine system have all of these different glands that we talked about, and you can see where they're located in the body. And basically they all produce hormones, and those hormones help regulate body functions. Next up is the excretory system. And the excretory system primarily is composed of the kidneys and then the bladder and the tubes that we use to connect them. The ureters, which connect the kidneys to the bladder, and then the urethra, which connects the bladder to the outside world. Okay, so let's take a look at the kidney real quickly. We'll notice that we have them here and they're located there. And what the kidneys do is they kind of work as a filter system for the blood. They take out a lot of the toxins in the blood for us. So as blood flows in, it'll get smaller and smaller into the capillaries, which will wrap around a nephron here. And you can see what happens is as the blood flows through, the concentration gradient will pull these toxic products out. And these toxic products will collect in the kidneys and then pass down to the bladder, where eventually they'll pass out of the body altogether. Now it's at this point we want to talk about a feedback loop. And a feedback loop, quite simply, is where we have a system that's monitoring what's going on, and that system will determine what the next steps are. So what we like to look at is a thermostat, and a thermostat's going to be there, and quite simply, if the room temperature decreases, it sends a message to the thermostat. The thermostat will then what? It'll turn on the heater and it will increase the temperature in the room. If it gets too warm, then it turns off that heater. So what this does is it kind of determines what's going on and what we want to process with. Now, the biggest feedback loop that we talk about in our body deals with dehydration, and that's why we mention it here. And what happens is if you're outside and it's hot, then you start to sweat, and sweating is going to lead to dehydration or a lack of water in the body. So as we lose water, our blood volume is going to decrease. And as our blood volume decreases, that means there's less of it going there. More of it's going to have to get to the skin to try and cool off. So now we're starving other parts of our body for blood. Because of this, it's not going to the lungs as much. We're trying to cool it off. We start to see this buildup of carbon dioxide. And when we build up carbon dioxide, the body's response is to breathe a little bit more rapidly. So we're trying to get that carbon dioxide out of the blood, and we're noticing that it's going on. Our kidneys start to react a little bit differently, and what they're going to do is they're going to try and put more water back into the system, so the blood there, so our blood volume will increase. And if none of these fail-safe checks work to cool us off and it all continues, ultimately we can have heat stroke and death is the end result. So the feedback loops kind of work as a system of the body saying, okay, we have all these different ways to regulate it. So once I start sweating, it's going to go here and feed into another loop, into another loop, into another loop. And ultimately, if it doesn't work out, that's what will cause us to die. But hopefully one of these loops will reverse the process. We can get the water and the fluids back into us and dehydration doesn't occur. Okay, so as we were talking about the excretory system, we have three different parts. We have the kidneys here, we have the bladder, we have the ureters and the urethra that are going to work through it. And the functions of the excretory system are to remove wastes, primarily from the body, but also to regulate the water balance. Okay, so that's it for this video. As always, good luck in the lessons, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to the Natural Defenses Against Disease video. In this video, we will describe the human immune system, we'll identify three parts of non-specific defense, and we'll discuss how the body has specific defenses against disease. Okay, so let's talk about the immune system. The immune system is what tries to keep pathogens out of our body or has a way of dealing with them if they make it into the body. And there's two different systems we'll talk about. The first one is this non-specific defense. And this is going to be if something gets inside, what we deal with, how we deal with those issues. And it doesn't target anything. It's just kind of a broad system that kind of works to get rid of all of the pathogens that it can. Now, the non-specific defense starts with the skin. And the skin is basically our barrier against the outside. It's what separates us from the environment. And that'll stop most of the pathogens and invaders from getting into us. There are a couple places where we want to have some interaction with the outside. And most of these places are lined with mucus. Like our lungs will have a little bit, but the passageways getting to the lungs are going to be covered that way. And what that does is it'll protect the surface of the body areas and it traps it. The mucus is going to be kind of sticky. It's like it's in your nose. It's what makes up your snot. And it traps those pathogens, doesn't let them get any further. Now the next two kind of work together. We have a complement protein which will fight a pathogen, but primarily what it does is it kind of bonds and signals the phagocytes to know that it's there. And these phagocytes will come in and they'll then consume these pathogens. So if we see these little pathogens here, what we notice is that these complement proteins will send a signal out, and then these phagocytes will come over and you can see them. They're actually like swallowing up these pathogens, and they'll break those down with enzymes and get rid of them that way. We also can have an inflammatory response, which will increase blood flow to that area. So that's why if you have a little cut or something and it gets like red around it, it's inflamed. What that is it's not on fire, but it's sending more blood to the area so that we can get all of these different complement proteins and phagocytes and things to this site so that they can fight that foreign body or those pathogens that are there. Okay, sometimes instead of it just being non-specific, it's a specific defense. And that means it'll target one specific pathogen. It'll go after that one, and that's what we see going on. With those, what we see is the use of lymphocytes. And our B lymphocytes are going to produce antibodies. So we'll see our B lymphocyte cell here producing these antibodies. These antibodies will then go out and they will grab onto this virus or whatever pathogen it is. And when they start doing this, they send out a signal to the phagocytes that'll come over there, and then they will consume these viruses in this case, and then they'll digestively start breaking them down inside of here. So we can get rid of a pathogen that way. We can also have a T lymphocyte, and the T lymphocyte is going to signal and destroy these infecting cells as well. Now, with the lymphocytes, sometimes what they'll do is they'll retain a little bit of a memory cell so that they know what these things are. And that way, if we get that same pathogen in our body recognizes it faster. It already knows what to do, and it can fight these a little bit quicker. So that's why if you got infected with the same pathogen twice, the first time might be a little bit rougher than the second time because your body already knows how to fix it and fight it. So that's the purpose we get vaccinations, and that's what leads us to immunity, is so that we know how to fight these pathogens inside of our bodies. So really quickly, we talked about the immune and lymph systems here. Their purposes are to protect the body from disease and to fight infection. And then the pieces and parts we wanted to make sure we knew of were the spleen and the thymus, and those help manufacture these white blood cells and these lymphocytes that we see. We have the lymph nodes, which we can see this lymph system here, and that basically transports these white blood cells throughout the body really quickly. Okay, so that's it for this video. As always, the lessons will go into a little bit more detail, so have fun with those, and we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on the human reproductive system. In this system, we'll go over the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system, and we'll talk a little bit about human fertilization and development. So here we see a picture of the male reproductive system. The male reproductive system has one primary function, and that occurs down here in the testes. And in the testes, what they're doing is they're going through the process of spermatogenesis, or forming sperm. So that sperm cells are going to go up here. Remember, those are the male gametes, and then ultimately for sperm delivery to be taken out that way. So the whole purpose of the male reproductive system is quite simply to make sperm, make those gametes so that it can send it off to the female so that we can have reproduction occurring. Now, the female reproductive system that we see here, that has two primary purposes. Up here in the ovaries is where we have oogenesis, and we're forming their gametes, or the egg cells, and then it's also where we will have the reception of the sperm, fertilization occurs, and then development of the embryo, and we'll talk about that part in the next slide. So here we see the process of fertilization occurring. So in the ovary inside of the females, where we have oogenesis, and that will leave out an egg into these fallopian tubes. Now, as the egg is traveling down the tube, it may encounter some sperm that we see going here. When one sperm goes inside of an egg, what happens is the nuclear material from the male DNA, joins the female DNA in the nucleus of the egg. It forms a capsule around the egg, and now it can no longer be fertilized again. And then we have what we call a zygote, and that zygote is going to be a fertilized egg. It starts to divide as it travels down the fallopian tube to becoming an embryo. When it gets an embryo, it reaches the uterus, and it's in the uterus that it will attach, and that's where this process of development then occurs. Okay, so that ends the video on our reproductive system. In the lessons, it'll go into a little bit more detail on these structures, but remember that the primary function of the reproductive system is to create sperm and eggs, and then to provide an area where those two can meet, fertilization occur, and we can nourish and develop this embryo inside the female. So that's it for the videos for the class. Good luck with the lessons, and thanks for watching.